Now at a high mass at this point, the priest blesses incense, and he starts incensing the altar. And the words that the priest uses when he blesses incense are ab illo benedicaris in cuius honorem cremabaris, which means, may you be blessed by him in whose honor you are to be burned. So the blessing is a very simple one. Well, back in the 1800s, Pope Pius IX was pope for a long time, longest reign of any pope except for St. Peter. He reigned from 1846 to 1878. Well, in that time, I don't know exactly what year this took place, but there were some Anglican visitors to Rome. And they got to be part of the audience with the Pope. And afterwards they asked to have a special blessing. And he said, well, you're Protestants. I can't give you a special blessing. And they insisted that there must be some blessing he could give them. And so as they knelt down, he said, ab illo benedicaris in cuius honore cremabaris. May you be blessed by him in whose honor you are to be burned. So, anyway, he had quite a wit. You can imagine he was smiling when he said it. Obviously, the burning, we can think, refers to the fires of purgatory, or, well, who knows, but anyway, it was quite a clever comeback by the Holy Father. Now, the incense is one of the gifts, too, that the Magi brought. Just yesterday, in yesterday's feast day of the Epiphany, we were thinking about the three gifts. Gold, because Jesus is a king. Myrrh, because he's going to die for us. Myrrh was always used for burials. And then frankincense, because he is God. Incense has always been given as worship to God. And so the martyrs, many of the martyrs have refused to even drop a little bit of incense, like to the god Apollo or the goddess Diana. The martyrs would have rather died than to turn over their hand and drop in some incense. And the reason I mention this is because you can see in our modern day that the Novus Ordo Catholics, or even traditional Catholics, I suppose, too, they don't think it's any big deal. They say, oh, so what? You know, if you go to another church or temple and you offer worship in another place, that's against the first commandment of God. Remember when Pope John Paul II was Pope, that's something that scandalized many Catholics, that he went to these other religions, to their temples, and he prayed with them. And he invited them all to come to Assisi twice in his pontificate to have them worship in our church, in the Catholic Cathedral of Assisi. And I remember an occasion when the Pope was in Africa, and they gave him a libation to pour out to their gods. It was milk or something in a bowl. And he poured it out. Now, you can think, well, Pope John Paul was obviously offering it as an offering to God, to the true God. But the saints never did that. St. Agnes, who was only 13 years old when she was apprehended by the Romans, she was just 13. And she was very thin, and they were threatening her with torture unless she would renounce Christianity. Well, of course she refused, and they then dragged her before their idols, their gods, and they were trying to force her to offer incense. In other words, they put incense in her hand, and then they tried to make her offer it to Apollo or a Diana or whoever it was. And she wouldn't do it. As a matter of fact, it says, and I don't know, obviously the description in her acts of her martyrdom are not in great detail, but it just says that they could not move her arm. They could not compel her to move her arm except to make the sign of the cross. The only time she moved her arm was to make the sign of the cross. Otherwise, they could not get this skinny 13-year-old girl to offer any incense to their false gods. Because she knew she could not just turn this over and say, I'm offering this to the Lord Jesus Christ. She couldn't do that. It would have been a scandal. And so she refused to move her arm. And then the judge ordered her to be stripped and to taken to a house of prostitution. And just to finish up the story, you know what happened. That St. Agnes was so pure and so modest that people turned away. They would not look at this young woman when she was stripped of her clothing. They were ashamed of what the judge was doing. But one young man had the temerity to look with lust on her, and immediately he was struck blind, and he was left half dead. Some accounts of the story say he actually was dead, and only through the prayer of St. Agnes was he restored back to life. But when she was in the house of prostitution, no one would dare come near her. There was like a holiness, a purity and holiness that surrounded her and protected her. Even though she was very beautiful, and many young men had desired her to marry them. And that's why, by the way, she was accused of being a Christian, because she had said, I have given my heart to Christ. I have espoused myself to Him. She had consecrated her virginity to God. So St. Agnes is a model for purity, but it's also interesting how they couldn't even get her to offer incense to their false gods, because incense is for worship, and she would only worship the true God. Matter of fact, she was so skinny that when they put the cuffs, those big cuffs on her to chain her up, they slipped off her hand. She could slide her hand right out of it. So, anyway, St. Agnes is a great model for the young people today, a great model of purity. Getting back to then the incensation of the altar, it makes sense then that the incense that is being offered in the incensing of the altar with the smoke going up should remind you of the prayer of the saints. You should think of St. Agnes and many other saints who are praying for us at that moment. Our prayers are very weak before God, but remember that if you unite yourself to the prayer of the saints, that their prayer will assist you. It'll make your prayer all the more powerful. Your Mass, your offering, will be much better and pleasing to God. Now finally...